Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the PyraTube. This is Liam Shy here with the fabulous Will Marshall from Coma Cartel. And we've got Adam Multiplier live from the UK joining us today. So very excited to have you, Adam. Thank you so much for being here.
Today,
it's good. Awesome. So today we have a very special topic. I think something that is not only near and dear to all of our hearts, but of the utmost important in your music production career, and that is mixing and mastering. So we're going to really cover two different locations. One is, what are the different techniques that we need to use depending on the destination? Is it going for release? Is it going to be on Spotify? Is it going to the club? And what are the considerations that we have to take into account in our own workflow to determine whether or not this is something we're going to maybe do stem mastering or we're going to play live, and all of the different types of considerations that we have to keep in mind when we go through this process. So we'll go ahead and kick it off. We'll start off with Adam, and we'll just go around really quick, do a quick introduction on who we are, what we do, and why we're here today, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Take it away, Adam.
Awesome, perfect. So yeah, my name is Adam, or the real name's Adam. You may know me as Multiplier. So if you just Google how to make music and stuff, you may have seen either my YouTube channel, which is Multiplier, for fair few subscribers and stuff on there, or I've also been doing tutorial courses for loads of the big websites. So and also kind of Loop Masters and a whole bunch of other like Splice and a few other companies too. So a whole bunch of tutorials, also sample pack work. I used to do a fair bit of DJing, had a record label as well. So pretty much everything that's kind of music related, making stuff and fun, I've probably got something to do with on the internet, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
And I'm Will Marshall. I teach the mixing mastering course with Ableton here at Pyramind, which is relevant to this. And I used to be, I guess, an electronic producer, kind of dance music. And these days I'm functioning as a composer and a producer for a live band. So I'm kind of sitting right between the electronic and the live music worlds, which makes this whole topic really, really interesting to me.
Excellent. My name is Liam Shy. I am an instructor here at Pyramind, along with Mr. Will Marshall. And actually, I should mention, all of us are mentors in the Pyramind Mentorship Network. So if you like anything that any of us say today, if anything catches your interest, right, going to do the shameless plug, you can absolutely book a session with us, get some one-on-one time, and we can sit down and take a look at your career, your music, your workflow, basically anything that's important to you to help you further and advance your career. And in terms of my background, I've been DJing since about 16 years now, teaching here at Pyramind for about 4 years, and then teaching independently for around 8 years. And I really cover the whole gamut, everything from live performance, DJing, music business, entrepreneurship, pretty much anything and everything that you can wrap your head around in the music industry, I've got a hand in. So. Very excited for the topic today. So I think we'll go ahead and kick it off, and we'll start off again with Multiplier. Keep the whole circle going here. So Multiplier, Adam, you talked to us a little bit, kind of as we were getting set up, about some of the ideas that you had in terms of understanding what the difference is between mastering when you're at home and what you're hearing in your studio and in the headphones, and how that can be so different from what's actually going on in the nightclub world. So why don't you kick off and talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think if you kind of look at it as two extremes, you've got your kind of studio space as kind of one extreme, where you've got either your really nice headphones or your really nice production monitors and maybe some acoustic treatment in the room. You've got kind of that one end of the spectrum, and then you have maybe the club at the other end. They are completely different extremes. So whenever you're making something in the studio, you've got to basically bear in mind that everything you're making will sound extremely dry, because theoretically you want to sound, you depending on how you've got your studio set up, you want it to sound as sort of kind of clean and as dry and unprocessed as possible. So your kind of tendency will be to almost throw tons and tons of effects on there, maybe really subtle. It could be like the most nuanced, subtle bit of reverb, or could be some really kind of crazy kind of atmospheric sound, but like 60 dB in the mix, so kind of really, really subtle, quiet stuff, which definitely improves the mix in the studio, because your studio is really dry, so you kind of want to fill up all the little kind of gaps in the mix with all the sorts of kind of interesting stuff that kind of gets you excited. But then at the other end of the spectrum in the club, basically it's almost like the club itself is applying a whole bunch of effects. Because if you imagine what happens at, say, like a big rave or something in like a big sort of venue, you've got the sound coming out the speakers, and that's then going to bounce off the walls and then go into the listener's ears. So you basically got, no matter what track you're making in the studio, you have to then realize that there's going to be some reverb added to it. So you have to kind of literally, if you're kind of making it for the club, you have to bear in mind that there will always be additional reverb added from the venue. And it even goes kind of further than that. So it's not just kind of reverb, which is maybe the most kind of the first thing that may come to mind when you're thinking about designing something for club. It's also stuff like saturation. So if in the studio, you may think about kind of doing all this kind of really, really subtle saturation, adding in these kind of tiny harmonics that sound kind of really subtle and really great through your like £1,000 headphones or whatever. But then all of that's going to get completely missed in the club because the speakers simply aren't going to be playing that really, really subtle saturation. And in fact, the speakers themselves in the club will often be saturating as well when they're kind of been overdriven. So you have to kind of imagine the club as being almost like applying its own effects, and your studio's dry. And therefore, depending on where you're mixing for, you have to kind of mix the opposite. So if you want your mix to sound great in the club, you want to make it really, really dry because the club's going to add its own effects. Whereas if you're mixing purely for kind of headphones and stuff, you want to mix really, really wet because it's going to fundamentally sound better with more effects and stuff.
I want to zoom out from that and expand on that and look at the like the destinations that like realistically you might be mixing and mastering for. And so the kind of club or live venue is the big one. But then there's also like different scenarios in which people listen at home. And the two that really stand out to me as being important are like iPhone or laptop speakers, which people listen to music on all the time and have very, very specific limitations, which you kind of need to think about if you want your music to translate to those. And then the other context is earbuds, like usually, basic ones, but even nice headphones, which have a very specific kind of set of strengths and weaknesses as well. And so it's interesting to look at each of these contexts and look at the things that these contexts do really, really well and the things that these contexts do poorly. Like headphones, all the like details and the ambience and stuff really come through, and the stereo field work really, really comes through. So you can be very intricate and precise, and that will translate well. On headphones, someone's put an iPhone down on a desk and is playing it. You don't even have a stereo field, so it's all collapsed to mono essentially. So you have to look at those limitations and either pick a target or find some kind of workable compromise between the three options. That would be my alarm.
Fired.
Oh yeah, I'm done. That's it. So to look at the limitations, I mean, Liam, what do you know about iPhone speakers or laptop speakers and their limitations?
Well, I think that's a fantastic point because that is, in fact, one of the ways that a lot of people are consuming music now. Even myself, I'm guilty of it. I have a great studio, I have loads of sound systems, and yet oftentimes if somebody sends me a track and I'm on the go, I'll just play it right there off my phone. And essentially what you're getting is the mids. Because you're not going to get really the low end represented very well, and you're not going to get the super high end represented very well either. So essentially, the focus is all going to be on that mid-range spectrum. And if you can make your mix actually shine and translate there, and this is actually really just good advice across the board, the mids are so important when you're doing your mixes and your masters because essentially you don't know where the destination is going to wind up. People might be listening to your track on a blimp, 1,000 feet above the earth, like, coming out of, who knows what, right? Some sort of, Bluetooth speaker or they might be banging it in a club. You have no idea, or it might be playing in a shopping mall, right? Where it's all going to be some mono. So you just really have to be prepared to understand that your mix is going to get just destroyed in terms of the types of systems that it's going to get played on, and make sure that it can actually translate. So I absolutely keep a copy of my phone. I keep my phone next to me in the studio, and I send a copy to it as I'm doing my masters. And I always just do a quick test right then and there and just listen to it. Does it sound good? Does it translate? And it's now so easy too with with Apple and the Messages app, right? It's on your computer, it's on your desktop, so you can literally just drop an MP3, text it to yourself, play it right there off your iPhone, and actually just get a real-time interpretation of how it sounds. And if there's any problems, catch it early on, nip it in the bud, because the last thing you want to do is actually release your track, put it out there into distribution channels, and then you realize that there's a problem. So cool. So I'd love to pivot a little bit and actually talk a little bit about sort of stem mixing and live performance. And, as we kind of go into, 2017 and beyond, we're seeing a lot more producers kind of break away from the traditional DJ mold. And now we're seeing a lot of folks doing, stem mixing, maybe 8 tracks using a push or APC 40. And I'd be curious to hear from both of you guys. What do you think about that? Have you had clients approach you and say, hey, I really want to get stem mixes? Or what is your experience with that? And what would your technique be to actually develop those masters?
So in the kind of the odd occasion where I do need to make some stem masters, in general, I would always kind of almost like steer more towards the idea of keeping it unprocessed and dry, just because almost because of the fact you're doing stem mixing, you kind of have to build in more headroom into the kind of the whole like gain staging and kind of like where the sound goes out of your kind of DJ setup. So almost by design, because of the fact you've decided to split everything up, you have to then one way or another build in kind of compressors and limiters and kind of however else you want to do it later on. So I'd always kind of steer more towards keeping it dry and kind of do less processing. Although to be fair, that's kind of how I tend to go in general now anyway, because of the loudness war kind of retreating and perceived loudness normalization. So I'm just more steering towards unprocessed and more dynamic anyway, but and then kind of more so for stem mixing.
Yeah, I do something very similar, because I do a lot of stem mixing because kind of part of a track is being performed live and part of it is coming out of the computer, and so everything necessarily has to be broken down when we perform. I find a lot of the work that I do to mix and get something sounding good on even studio monitors, even sounding good on small speakers and stuff like that, is work I end up unpicking when I go in and try and mix stuff for performance. And I have access to some really big PAs and stuff, and so I can go in and test how things sound in like a fairly real scenario, and it's always edifying. The biggest thing, like this really stands out to me as a specific, is I do a lot of work with kind of 808 style low end, which is basically tuned sine waves, right? And they're hovering down, 50, 60 hertz. They're pretty low. And a lot of systems aren't able to produce those frequencies. So I spend a lot of time investing in very careful distortion and parallel processing and kind of techniques to fake the sound of that kind of deep low end on a small system. If you listen to like a new Beyonce album or something on your phone, you'll hear the bass, even though the bass is obviously not being produced there. And it's a lot of work. You take that processed 808 sound and you put it on a really big system, and all of a sudden you're getting the subtone itself, like the actual low end. And then you're getting all of the distortion and stuff that you layered on top to get it to pop on laptop speakers or stuff. And it usually makes it worse. Like in any kind of club environment, your low end is being produced loudly enough that you can get by with pretty much just pure sine waves for everything, because people can legitimately hear that. So you don't need to do that kind of silly dance to try and get it popping on big speakers.
Excellent point. Yeah, really, really good point. A little bit of psychoacoustics in there, right? Yeah, exactly. Cool. So, all right. So one of the other topics that I think would be kind of interesting to dive into is the concept of sort of the loudness wars and what that means in terms of potentially making multiple masters. I myself, I prefer to actually make 2 different masters whenever I do typically my own work, and I'll offer this to clients as well as an option, particularly if they're performing live. But one of the things that I sort of hate is, well, obviously the loudness wars, but like I hate mastering my tracks for this sort of very competitive dynamic range battle that we've gotten ourselves into, or lack of dynamic range, I should say. And so one of the things that I've just sort of incorporated into my workflow is a way to sort of make myself feel better about the process and actually feel happier with the result is I'll make a version which I put for release, which is going to be the very squashed, very loud, very competitive, version that is sort of expected in 2017. But then I'll keep a version for myself, which is usually going to be 32-bit. And I'm going to make sure that it's not super, super compressed. I'm going to make it very, very much almost like the pre-master, because in my opinion, the pre-master is actually the truest expression of what the song is trying to be. If it was up to me, I would never master anything, because that's what mixing is for. When I mix, I make it sound beautiful, lush, gorgeous. All of my relative, gains are set exactly how I want them to be. And mastering is just basically, taking a big, crap across all of my hard work. And so I really hate that I have to master, so that's kind of what I've personally done is I keep this version for myself, for my own live performances, and I offer it to clients. I say, hey, if you're performing live, and you're going to play all your own music in a set, well, guess what? There's nothing for you to compete with or compare to. Just make sure that when you go on, the sound guy turns it up a couple dB and you're good to go. So what do you guys think about that, Adam?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the really big things to bear in mind about the Loudness War is this thing called perceived loudness normalization. So if you have two tracks that are different loudnesses, the playback platform and even the DJ will actually compensate for this automatically. So it's actually a little bit counterintuitive. So if you make your track louder, then everywhere apart from SoundCloud and maybe the Beatport preview player still currently will actually simply turn it down. So all your kind of YouTubes or your iTunes or your DJs, and even listeners in their car quite a lot, people that like ride the volume control, will actually automatically compensate for loudness. So if you make your track really loud in the master, that means it's going to get turned down, so you're actually getting a smaller dynamic range. So, and it is pretty linear as well. So unless you're making your track like quieter than anything else in the genre, if you want the greatest dynamic range, you want to be as quiet as possible, if that makes sense. So the way I kind of approach loudness myself, if I'm making a track in a particular genre, I'll measure perceived loudness using LUFS for, like 50 or 100 tracks in the genre. And then I'll kind of pitch my track somewhere in the bottom, sort of 10, 15, 20% or so of loudness is that way. All these kind of platforms like Spotify, YouTube, DJs, and iTunes and so on, they'll turn my track up like pretty much as far as it can go. So I get more dynamic range compared to most other tracks in the genre. Yeah.
I do something very similar. Like when I'm mastering my own work, because of that volume matching that happens on most of the platforms now, I'm not concerned with pushing the volume of the track high. I'm concerned with it not being low because I don't want it to, drop much lower on SoundCloud or something like that. But a lot of what, especially the limiting stage of mastering, a lot of what I'm actually paying attention to there is shaping the kind of transients of my track to translate better on small systems, which don't have much headroom, but also translate better on really big, because like a big, well-engineered club system, an unlimited kind of drum transient can feel like whiplash in the wrong circumstances. And so, I've gone with no limiting or just, half a dB of limiting and played it on a big system. And I actually found that often it's uncomfortable. Like the dynamic range of the drum sounds is so high that it feels wrong. So I end up limiting until the point where it sounds best, which is usually some, but not too much. And that brings it up to kind of an average level that feels fine to me as a rule.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think the one thing to bear in mind would be, I suppose, like the one main exception would be dubstep, where almost a part of the art of dubstep is having that really, really flattened out sound. So that kind of really one-dimensional sort of super squish sound. So even though, strictly speaking, you can make like a crazy, crazy loud dubstep track, which would then end up having a smaller dynamic range because of perceived loudness normalization, that's still a kind of a part of the dubstep spirit of having this sort of really flattened out, almost like having those distortion artifacts from the limiting is kind of a part of the art of dubstep at times. So, I suppose also kind of electro house as well, sometimes as well. So yeah, sometimes the mastering certainly not in most genres, but in some genres like your dubsteps and stuff, is kind of a huge part of what makes the tracks. So I suppose you could consider that mixing, depending on how you define mastering. But
yeah, when I do that kind of bass work, I could typically do it in the mix rather than in the master, just so I have more control. But it's the same work. It's like clipping and limiting to get that kind of brick wall on-off, almost gated sound, which sounds really good. The other thing I've noticed through like commercial releases rather than say the versions of tracks people perform is obviously the less bass. Bass takes up most of the headroom in a mix. And on most systems that bass can't actually be reproduced. So I've noticed, I was studying Grizz tracks a while back, and he's kind of a bass music guy. He's known for his low end. And looking at the kind of sub frequencies of his published tracks, there's actually very, very little low end in them. There's a lot of overtones, there's a lot of harmonics that imply low end. But one of the reasons I think he's able to get such a loud sounding mix is there's just bugger all sub down there. And I think in his live versions, he probably has a version that has a lot more of that sub and a lot less of the kind of distorted overtone. But that way, even the Spotifys of the world, when they calculate your average loudness, they're calculating it based on the part people can actually hear, rather than all that low end that gets lost anyway.
Yeah, definitely. And it's that kind of counterintuitive thing where people would expect, say, like your genres like dubstep and drum and bass to have the loudest kind of bass frequencies because it's all about the bass in those sort of genres. But if you actually measure it, it's got lower bass in than, say, like house and techno at times, which doesn't have all that kind of mid range. So it's kind of, yeah, I mean, to be honest, you can kind of measure the level of those things. Like if you measure, say, like take dubstep or electro house, if you look at where the sub frequencies are hitting in the spectrum analyzer, they're all pretty much sitting within 2 or 3 dB of each other. Like literally every single track in the entire genres, the subs sit in between, say, like -4 at the very extreme, and then maybe -7 at the very quietest extreme. But it's in this like extremely narrow band. So by just literally measuring kind of with a spectrum analyzer what everyone else is doing at the time, you can then make sure your track's in the same sort of ballpark, because it's not like it's objectively better or worse having your sub hitting a certain level relative to all your other frequencies, but you have to be in the same sort of ballpark as everybody else because everyone's working with the same system and they're working with the same setups.
Yeah, and they've found a sweet spot as well. There's kind of a relationship between the sub and the rest of the bass that feels natural, where you're providing enough of that low end extension to feel deep, but kind of no more than that. And if you're outside of that range, you're going to start to feel either all hollow or a little kind of flabby, other ways it tends to go.
Yeah, definitely. And the one cool trick I've seen quite a lot of the guys been doing over the last few years is to almost get that best of both worlds, is kind of have all that kind of mid-range and stuff, so it will kind of translate through laptop speakers and stuff. Like if you listen to especially sort of the early Skrillex stuff, it's kind of all mid-rangey, and then he's still got the sub in there, but then he doesn't have many harmonics for the sub, so he's kind of not killing headroom by having the kind of the second and third harmonics for the sub. Rambling a little bit. So it's kind of like he's got all the mid-range and stuff, so it translates through kind of phone speakers and laptops and just kind of sounds like really audible. And he's still got the sub in there, so it sounds good through big speakers, but then he doesn't waste any headroom by having those kind of second and third harmonics for the sub, because, I mean, there's almost no situations where that's advantageous. Like if you have the big speaker systems that can play the sub, then the sub's been played and that's great. Whereas otherwise, you probably can't play those low frequencies, so you might as well just kind of focus on those more middle frequencies.
Yeah, I remember when I was doing trancey kind of bass lines back in the day, I would use Ableton's operator, where you can knock out the harmonics of the saw wave and just knock out the second and third harmonics almost completely, and just opened up a lot of low end that was otherwise kind of filling in your mix in an unhelpful way.
Clean up the mud.
Yeah. So to move away from sub a little bit and like look at the leads and the focal point of your track. If we look at phones and like laptop speakers and stuff for a minute, I think one of the things that's really important about those is if you chop off the low end, and that the low end is kind of a physical thing. It's all about that experience. It's felt. But typically, from a compositional perspective, the sub is really just reinforcing what's happening on top. And then you chop off the high end, which is mostly hi-hats and things like it's rhythmic. you're focusing on your actual songwriting. And that's a really important principle, I think, is if your song sounds like a good song on really bad speakers, that it has to do so because it's an intrinsically good song, that you've written something good. And I think especially when we're in, nice expensive studios with subs and treatment, it can be very easy to write something that feels very satisfying, but it feels very satisfying kind of physical rather than compositional reasons. And then when you chop that low end and that high end off, all of a sudden it feels very empty and kind of very, very unsatisfactory. And this happens to me all the time. I'm leaning so heavily on kind of the weight of the low end that when it's not there, the whole thing falls apart. So that, I think, is useful because memorable tracks, like music that is held onto, that people listen to for a long time, that people kind of relate to, it's about the songwriting and the composition first and foremost. Even, really big club tracks are typically good songwriting with then good production kind of layered on top of it.
Right.
So that focus is really important. And you mentioned something about noise floor and kind of ambience and mixing more dry. And something I wanted to say on that was like a headphone version of a track often, in my experience, at least in my world, has literally more parts in it, like synth sounds and stuff like that are just stripped out for the live version. Have either of you done anything like that before?
Yeah, definitely. I don't normally personally make multiple versions of the mix, but I do basically employ exactly the same principle. So I kind of have to decide, right, where on this spectrum do I want my track to sound best? And then everywhere else is literally going to be a compromise. Like there's literally no such thing as a perfect mix. There's just a mix that kind of sounds better or worse in one or two or three different situations. So the way I like to approach mixing is kind of one of the big things I'm pushing right now is instead of thinking, right, how do I add something to make something better? Like, do I saturate here or do I pan this to make it sound better? Instead of thinking about making something better or worse, instead think about how it's affecting the track in different situations. So when you apply, say, saturation, you're not making it better or worse. You're just going to make it sound better in some situations and worse in other ones. And the same applies to reverb and stuff. So if you take a kick drum, you can apply some really subtle reverb to it. And that's not making it better or worse. It's just going to make it sound better through headphones, but then worse through kind of like a really sort of like, I don't know, like a rave or really sort of wet live situation. So yeah, that's kind of the way I like to kind of change the way people are framing these kind of mixing decisions. It's not better or worse. It's making it different, which will make it sound better over here, but worse over there. So,
well, one of the biggest techniques that was kind of a like an aha moment for me was when I realized the power of just making sure that all of the drops, the choruses, whatever you want to call it, have to be basically completely dry. Just no reverb, very little delay, if any. Just make the drops super, super dry, and then make the breakdowns super wet. Go crazy, have all the reverb that you want, just make it big and lush and beautiful, and that sounds okay. But then the second that you come back and you bring that beat back in, you pull all that stuff out, and that not only then ensures that you're delivering a clean, loud, present mix, which will translate better in the nightclubs and all of that. But it also creates a nice emotional impact as well. And it actually makes the whole thing feel as though it's gotten bigger, which is another kind of psychoacoustic trick to make you feel like, oh, it got louder. It didn't really get louder. It just got drier. But it works fantastic.
Yeah. That minimalism, like not overusing effects as well. I think it's hard to adopt that, especially in the studio, because we can throw effects on things and they usually make it sound better. But there are a couple of things about if you mix very dry and with very limited effects, it forces you to kind of focus more on the actual composition of the track you're working on rather than the kind of the ear candy. And I think one of the traps, certainly for me, I fall into, and I think a lot of people struggle with this, is you can take something that is not a great part, that is not a bad part, put some effects on it and make it sound really interesting. The problem with that is that it only sounds really interesting in some environments and it sounds like garbage in other environments. So you end up with this kind of moving target problem where you can't make it sound good in a lot of places. Whereas if you mix very dry and very clean, and you can still make it sound good just through compositional techniques and kind of basic sounds, it translates much better across all these different systems because you're not reliant on kind of specifics of studio wizardry to get things sounding good. And that was very hard for me to learn, and I still struggle with kind of forcing myself not to use reverbs when I'm composing. I do a lot of composition just with sine waves now, so that I have to focus purely on the actual notes before thinking about like tone and sound and how that's going to translate.
Right. Or if you are going to insist on using reverb, maybe sidechain your reverb, for example. Try to really tame it and control it so that it's not just sort of running wild.
One of the traumatic things I always do in my mixing classes, people bring their tracks that they're working on the mix in, and we finish the mix. And step one is to delete every single reverb in the entire project, which of course in a treated room makes it sound awful. Right. But it then forces us to rebuild those reverbs from scratch, kind of one step at a time, and ending up with almost none, usually, just very carefully placed.
Definitely. I mean, if you listen to some of like Diplo's biggest tracks as Major Lazer and Jack Hugh and everything, they're incredibly dry at times, like almost spookily dry. But because he's Diplo and he knows how to kind of write amazing songs and stuff, it still works everywhere. It's just really, really cool.
Awesome. So I kind of want to wrap it up a little bit, but what I think would be fantastic for our audience out there is maybe we could all just go around and share sort of one secret, if you will, like one trick or one tip or one like plugin you use or workflow thing that you do that you really feel helps to give you sort of an advantage or more clarity or make more informed choices or decisions that you would be willing to, pass along to all of our fellow producers out there.
Adam?
Yep. So one of my favorite tricks that is, I'm sure other people do it as well, but it's one of my kind of personal favorites. So if you're kind of struggling to make your sounds kind of professional or unique, for lack of a better term, if you grab a copy of Isotope Trash 2, which is probably one of the most well-known sort of mixing, especially for basses, but also leads, it's one of the most well-known mixing plugins. If you basically go to the default preset and turn off all the modules, so you're kind of starting off fresh, and then you only use the Convolve module, which is that convolution reverb module, it's just like it's an extremely powerful way just to make literally any element at all, from your kind of drums to your basses to your leads, sound effects, to kind of give it a bit of something else in a really sort of strange way. So you can either use it kind of really, really wet to make it sound like really, really 3D and kind of unique, or you can use it more subtly, so it doesn't kind of dominate, but it still gives it that little bit of extra something else for headphones. So something I like doing if I just want to give it that bit of extra something else but not distract, I'll literally set the dry wet mix to like 1.5%, 2%. So it's adding that little bit of ear candy for headphones, but it's not completely ruining everything. Because it's basically a convolution reverb, but most of the impulses, like presets, if you will, are kind of really short, so it kind of gives body to things. So it's not like a convolution reverb that gives like a space effect. It instead takes really boring sounds or kind of simple sounds and then makes them kind of 3D and real. But if you subtly, it just gives it that little kind of bit of shine, and it's something that like pretty much all the biggest guys like Noisier and Skrillex and everyone uses it. So so it's basically go to the default preset, turn everything off, and then go to the Convolve section for convolution reverb. It's really, really cool.
Yeah, great plugin. Love that one.
My big kind of magic trick, which I do at the end of pretty much every mix now, is actually similar in principle. I use a tape emulation plugin called Yuhi Satin, which is just an emulation of like a high quality mastering tape machine. And at the kind of very final stage of the mix, when I've boiled everything down to kind of 8 or 9 buses, I'll go through and put an instance of Satin on each of those buses. And it has a feature that you could do it by hand with a different plugin, where you can sync them all together. So you make changes to one instance of the VST and it changes all of them. So it's just one set of parameters. And that, when kind of placed on the groups in a very subtle way, like very gentle, very clean mastering tape, almost no noise, does absolute wonders to sticking all these often like disparate, very electronic sounds together and putting them all in the same space. It does a lot to stereo field, which I don't fully understand, to be honest, but the spatialization, the kind of your understanding of the stereo field improves radically when you do it. It sticks everything together and it provides this kind of quality sheen that otherwise I don't get. You can do similar things with like analog summing. You can use real tape. There are a lot of approaches to it, but that can make all the difference between a slightly kind of jagged and not quite cohesive sounding electronic mix, which is very easy to do, or something that sounds very polished and kind of all put together neatly.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank you guys. So I guess for me, my secret weapon that I would like to share with you guys, it's kind of two things in one. So first, I cannot understate the importance of A-Bing your tracks, particularly when you're doing mixing and when you're doing mastering. This is something that I have to do all the time because I work a lot on client projects. So I'm getting lots of different genres of music. People are coming from lots of different backgrounds and they have different needs and different wants. And so one of the things I always communicate with my clients is, hey, send me 2 or 3 reference tracks that really nail the aesthetic, the mix, and the loudness that you're looking for. Those are the 3 kind of things that I need so that I can make sure to really nail the master, that final track when I deliver it back to you. But one of the things that's also instrumental in that process of A-Bing and just being really on top of the levels is Adobe Audition. Adobe Audition has recently become, maybe not so recently, last couple of years, a very integral part of my mastering workflow. So basically, after I finish with Ableton, I export the master out. I always bring it into Adobe Audition and I run it through, and I actually can analyze very, very detailed specs on all of the different loudness levels, dBTP, LUFS. I can look at the ITU broadcast standards. I can really get in and nail all of my levels exactly. And this is a lot more precise than trying to use a meter, which is constantly kind of going up and down. And you're kind of like, oh, it's a -3 RMS. Now it's a -5 RMS, and you're like, well, where is it? It's about somewhere in there, right? With this, you actually can analyze it and get the full overview of all the loudness specifications. And then you can also use that as, again, part of the A-B process. So you can A-B your reference tracks. Where are they sitting? Where are you sitting? And one of the things that's sort of shocked me over the last couple of years of really integrating Adobe Audition into my process is how clipped these masters are that I'm hearing from professional releases. I mean, it's almost 90% guaranteed that when I bring in a reference track from some big producer, it's clipped. It's dBTP like over 1, 2, 3 dB sometimes, and it blows my mind. So I don't clip my masters. I think that's important. So anyway, Adobe Audition and just A-B. Really, get a hotkey set up in Key Command so you can just really quickly toggle, go back and forth, because that's really going to help you nail into the sound that you're striving for. Yeah? Awesome. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to actually have you, to finally meet you, Mr. Adam Multiplier, Will Marshall of Coma Cartel, fantastic band, doing some really innovative stuff, myself, Liam Shy, and again, we are all within the Pyramind Mentorship Network. That means literally you can go right now and book time with us. You can book time with us right now. You can one-on-one. You, me, you, maybe the 3 of us, who knows? Like, it can get crazy, right? Google Hangouts, I think you can get up to 10 people on a session. So definitely give us a call. Let's work together. Let's make some magic happen. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
If you're a music producer, subscribe to our channel and stay up to date on the latest Pyramind tutorial videos, track breakdowns, elite sessions, and more. Visit us at pyramind.com.